"Don't touch my daughter!" The shout tore through the garage just as the metal braces shrieked in protest. Steel joints locked too fast, too hard, and the young woman's body pitched forward, balance slipping as if the floor itself had betrayed her. For a split second, gravity won. The black mechanic lunged on instinct, hands rising to steady her, then froze mid-step at the raw fury in the billionaire's voice. The girl caught herself at the last possible moment, palms slamming against the workbench. Her breath came sharp and shallow. The sound of strained metal lingered in the air like a warning that no one else seemed to hear. Marcus Reed pulled his hands back slowly, deliberately, as if even the space between them might offend. At 35, he had learned the cost of moving too fast in the wrong direction. He stood there, oil-stained shirt clinging to his back in the Texas heat, eyes calm but alert, saying nothing. The old radio on the shelf kept playing, some gravel-voiced singer crooning about broken roads and second chances, oblivious to the tension coiling inside the cinder-block walls. The man in the tailored suit stepped forward, placing himself between Marcus and his daughter with practiced authority. Richard Stone didn't look at the garage, the tools, or the faded American flag hanging beside the bay door. He looked only at Marcus, and his gaze carried the weight of money, control, and a lifetime of being obeyed. "You stay away from her," Richard said, each word clipped and final. "You don't touch her. Ever." The young woman Emily straightened with effort, her jaw tight as she eased herself back into the folding chair. The braces at her legs gleamed under the fluorescent lights, sleek and expensive, built by people who had never asked her what hurt and where. She swallowed, forcing the pain down where she'd learned to keep it. Her eyes flicked to Marcus, just for a second. In that glance lived surprise, relief, and something dangerously close to hope. Marcus nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I didn't," he said quietly. "I wouldn't," Richard scoffed. "You were about to." "I was about to stop her from falling," Marcus replied, voice steady. "That's all." Silence pressed in, thick and uncomfortable. Outside, a freight train rumbled past, the vibration traveling through the cracked concrete floor. Marcus had grown up with that sound. It reminded him that things were always moving, whether you were ready or not. An hour earlier, the day had been ordinary. Marcus had unlocked his garage before sunrise, same as always, brewed cheap coffee on the hot plate, and tuned the radio to a station that still played songs from before everything felt so fast. East Austin was already warm, the kind of heat that promised to settle in your bones. Cars passed by without slowing, most drivers barely noticing the squat little building crouched near the tracks. Reed Auto. The sign read in peeling blue paint, one corner bent from a storm years back. Beside it, the American flag hung, faded but stubborn, refusing to come down. Marcus liked that flag. It reminded him that staying upright didn't always mean staying pristine. He'd been halfway under a pickup truck when the sound reached him, a smooth, unfamiliar engine straining under stress. Not the cough of an old sedan, or the rattle of something neglected, but the kind of mechanical whisper that came with money. When the black SUV rolled into his gravel lot, glossy and out of place, Marcus knew before anyone stepped out that this visit wouldn't be simple. Emily had emerged first, moving carefully, one hand braced on the door, metal glinting along her legs. Marcus noticed the way she held herself, the way pain lived just beneath the surface of her calm. He always noticed that. Years of fixing broken things had taught him that damage wasn't always loud. Richard Stone followed her out, irritation already etched into his face. "The engine overheated," he'd said, as if the explanation itself should bend reality back into place. "We need it checked." Now, Marcus hadn't asked who he was. He didn't need to. The suit, the watch, the way the man surveyed the garage like it might stain him, those details told the story well enough. Marcus lifted the hood, diagnosed the problem in seconds. A failing thermostat. Simple, fixable. It was everything else that wasn't. As he worked, Marcus had kept glancing toward Emily, seated stiffly on the folding chair near the wall. The braces were wrong. He could see it as clearly as a misaligned axle. Too rigid. Too much pressure in the wrong places. Designed to impress, not to move. He'd hesitated, knowing the line he was about to cross. He crossed it anyway. "Ma'am," he'd said gently, "do those hurt you?" Richard had bristled immediately. "You speak to me." But Emily had answered. "Yes," she'd said, almost surprised by her own honesty. Marcus had explained himself carefully. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't claim miracles. He just understood mechanics, and bodies moved according to the same laws as machines. Balance mattered. Alignment mattered. When he offered to show her a safer way to stand, he'd made sure to keep his distance, his hands clearly visible, his voice calm. For one brief moment, it had worked. Emily had straightened. The pain had eased just enough to make her gasp, and then everything collapsed into shouting and orders and fear disguised as protection. Now, standing in the aftermath, Marcus wiped his hands on a rag he didn't need. Richard was already ushering Emily toward the SUV, his grip firm, his jaw set. "We're leaving," he said. There was no room for discussion. Emily turned her head as she was guided away. Her mouth opened, the words right there. "Thank you." She wanted to say it. She needed to. But the door closed, the engine roared, and the moment vanished down the road in a cloud of dust. Marcus watched the SUV disappear, the radio filling the silence once more. He went back to his work, slid beneath the pickup, and tightened the bolt he'd left waiting. Some people pass through your life like accidents, he thought. Sudden, loud, leaving marks you didn't see until later. Across town, Emily stared out the window, her heart racing for reasons she didn't yet understand. For the first time since the crash that had taken her legs from her, someone had treated her pain like a problem that could be understood, not a sentence to be endured. She hadn't said thank you, and she knew, deep down, that this wouldn't be the last time she thought about the man who had stepped forward and stopped himself when the world told him not to. If you've ever seen someone judged before they were understood, take a second to like this story and leave a comment below. Tell us what you felt when Emily almost fell, and Marcus chose respect over fear. Your voice matters here, and your story might be the one that helps someone else stand a little taller today. By the time the black SUV reached the gates of the Stone estate, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across manicured lawns that never showed signs of drought. The house sat high above the city, all glass and limestone, designed to look open while keeping the world firmly outside. Emily felt the familiar tightening in her chest as the car rolled to a stop. This place had once meant safety. Now it felt like a well-appointed cage. Richard Stone didn't speak during the drive. His jaw stayed locked, eyes fixed on the road as if the traffic itself had personally offended him. When the driver opened Emily's door, Richard was already out, one hand raised in a sharp, practiced gesture that dismissed any offer of help. He watched closely as Emily eased herself out, every movement monitored, every wince catalogued. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish and something warm baking in the kitchen, though Emily knew she wouldn't taste it. Her braces clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way toward the living room. Richard followed a step behind, his presence heavy, controlling, impossible to ignore. "You will not go near that place again," he said at last, breaking the silence. "Do you understand me?" Emily lowered herself onto the sofa, exhaustion settling into her bones. "Dad, I don't want excuses." He turned to face her fully now, anger barely restrained. "That man had no right. None. You don't know him. You don't know what kind of people." "What kind of people?" Emily interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. It surprised them both. Richard hesitated, just for a moment. Then he recovered. "He's not qualified. He's dangerous." And he was out of line. Emily looked down at her legs, at the metal that gleamed so expensively yet betrayed her with every step. "He didn't touch me," she said quietly. "He asked me what hurt." Richard waved a hand, dismissive. "That's how it starts. You don't understand the risks." Emily did understand risk. She had lived with it since the night of the accident, since the twisted metal and screaming sirens, and the doctor's voice that had softened when it delivered the truth. Risk was waking up every morning knowing your body might betray you again. Risk was hoping, and hope, her father feared most of all. She didn't argue further. Years of recovery had taught her when to conserve her strength. Richard took her silence as agreement and left the room, already pulling his phone from his pocket, his world snapping back into place with meetings and calls and problems he knew how to solve. Emily remained on the sofa long after his footsteps faded, her thoughts fixed stubbornly on a garage that smelled of oil and dust and something honest. Across town, Marcus Reed closed his garage later than usual. The thermostat fix had been simple, but his hands had moved slower afterward, his mind replaying the moment again and again. The sound of metal straining, the fear in the girl's eyes, the way the father's voice had filled the space like a weapon. He'd seen that look before. Not the wealth, the fear, the kind that dressed itself up as authority and called it protection. Marcus locked the bay door and leaned back against it for a moment, letting the cool metal press into his spine. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He had enough of his own. But some things, once noticed, refused to be unseen. That night, Emily lay awake listening to the house settle around her. From her bedroom window, the city lights glittered like distant stars. She flexed her feet beneath the covers, the braces resting against the mattress, heavy even at rest. Her body remembered the way it had felt in the garage. Straighter, lighter, less wrong. She pressed her lips together, the unspoken thank you rising again, unfulfilled. In the days that followed, Richard tightened his grip. Physical therapy appointments were rescheduled, then canceled. New specialists were consulted, new opinions were gathered. Emily endured them all with polite detachment, answering questions she'd answered 100 times before. Each night, she thought of Marcus Reed, though she didn't yet know his name. She thought of the way he'd stopped himself when told, the respect in that restraint. It mattered more than he could have known. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to his routine. He fixed engines. He replaced worn belts. He listened to stories from men who'd worked the same jobs for decades, and women who needed their cars to last just a little longer. Life went on, stubborn and unremarkable. Still, every time a black SUV passed his lot, his attention lifted. Just for a second, a week later, Richard Stone stood in a conference room overlooking downtown, glass walls framing a skyline he'd helped shape. He spoke with authority, outlining investments and timelines, but part of his mind remained elsewhere. He hated surprises. He hated uncertainty, and the memory of his daughter nearly falling in that garage gnawed at him, uninvited. He pushed it aside. Control was how you kept chaos at bay. Control was love, he told himself. Emily felt the weight of that belief every day. She complied, she smiled, but something had shifted. A small crack had formed, letting in a draft of possibility. She began to practice standing on her own in the privacy of her room, remembering Marcus's calm instructions. Shift your weight, trust the ground. Some nights, she managed a few seconds before the pain forced her back down. Other nights, she failed completely. Still, she tried. One afternoon, while her father was away on business, Emily convinced her driver to take a longer route home from a medical appointment. She said she wanted to see the city. It wasn't a lie. As the car turned onto a familiar road near the tracks, her heart began to pound. The garage came into view, unchanged, unassuming, Reed Auto, the faded flag stirring slightly in the breeze. "Just stop for a moment," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. The driver hesitated, then complied. Emily didn't open the door. She didn't wave. She just looked. Marcus was there, bent over an engine, his movements sure, focused. He didn't see her. That was fine. Seeing him was enough. The gratitude she'd carried with her finally found somewhere to rest, even if it remained unspoken. As the car pulled away, Emily leaned back against the seat, a small, private smile touching her lips. She didn't know how or when, but she knew one thing with quiet certainty. Their paths were not finished crossing. And somewhere in East Austin, a man who fixed broken machines went on with his day, unaware that he had already changed a life by choosing patience over fear and respect over impulse. The second time Emily Stone saw Marcus Reed, it was not in a moment of crisis, and that difference mattered more than either of them realized. It happened on a Tuesday morning that felt almost gentle by Austin standards. The heat hadn't fully settled in yet, and the sky was a pale, forgiving blue. Emily had insisted on running a small errand herself, something minor enough that her father hadn't objected. A stop at an auto parts store on the edge of downtown, where the driver could wait and she could feel, for once, like a woman handling her own life. She told herself it was about independence. She didn't admit, not even to herself, that she had chosen the location carefully. The store smelled of rubber and motor oil, familiar and oddly comforting. Emily moved slowly through the aisles, her cane tapping softly against the concrete floor. She paused near a rack of hoses she didn't need, steadying herself, when she heard a voice she recognized before she understood why. "You're gonna want the reinforced belt, not the standard. Saves you from doing the job twice." Marcus stood a few feet away, holding a box in one hand, explaining something to an older man in a baseball cap. He looked the same as he had in the garage work, worn, focused, unremarkable in a way that drew attention once you learned how to see it. Emily felt her chest tighten. For a second, she considered turning away. Then Marcus glanced up. Their eyes met. Surprise crossed his face, quickly followed by something gentler. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact rather than a coincidence. "Morning," he said, his tone easy, giving her space. "Morning," Emily replied. The word felt heavier than it should have, weighted with everything she hadn't said before. The older man wandered off, leaving them in a pocket of quiet between shelves. Emily gestured awkwardly with her cane. I never got to thank you." Marcus shrugged, not dismissive, just careful. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," she said softly. "You treated me like I wasn't broken." He studied her for a moment, the way he studied engines before deciding where to start. "You aren't," he said. "You're injured. There's a difference." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They stood there, two strangers connected by a moment that refused to stay in the past. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. "You look steadier." "I've been practicing," she admitted. "What you showed me. When I can." A flicker of pride crossed his face, quickly masked. "That's good. Consistency matters more than intensity." They talked for a few minutes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have alarmed anyone watching. Marcus mentioned his shop, the slow season, the price of parts going up again. Emily spoke about physical therapy, about doctors who meant well and still managed to miss the point. There was no mention of her father, no mention of fear, just two people trading truths without judgment. When the driver appeared at the end of the aisle, Emily knew the moment was ending. She hesitated, then said, "I'd like to keep talking. If that's okay." Marcus considered her carefully, not weighing desire but consequences. "You should be the one deciding that," he said. "Not me." She smiled, small but real. "Then I am." From that day on, Emily found reasons to pass through East Austin. Sometimes it was as simple as asking the driver to take a longer route, or requesting a stop that felt just plausible enough not to invite questions. Other times, she went alone, claiming independence with a confidence that surprised even her. Marcus never invited her. He never discouraged her. He simply made room. The garage became something different when Emily was there. Marcus pulled a folding chair closer to the open bay door so she could sit without strain. The radio stayed low. Conversation came easily, not because they tried, but because neither felt the need to perform. Marcus spoke about growing up near those same railroad tracks, about a father who'd taught him how to fix things and a mother who'd taught him when not to. He spoke about being overlooked, underestimated, and how he'd learned to measure success in quieter ways. Emily listened, absorbing not just his words but the steadiness behind them. In return, she spoke about the accident, not in dramatic detail, but in the way one might describe a scar, acknowledging its presence without letting it define the whole body. She spoke about the loneliness of recovery, about being protected until protection became another kind of cage. Between conversations, Marcus showed her exercises, small adjustments, shifts of weight that respected her limits while gently challenging them. He never touched her without asking. Often, he didn't touch her at all. "Your body needs to remember it's in charge," he told her once. "I'm just here to remind it." Weeks passed. Emily's visits grew more frequent. She began leaving the cane by the chair, practicing short distances without it. The first time she managed 3 full steps unassisted, she laughed, a sound so bright Marcus felt it in his chest. He looked away, giving her the dignity of the moment. Not everyone approved. A patrol car slowed once, the officer's gaze lingering longer than necessary before moving on. A neighboring shop owner muttered something about trouble. Marcus took it in stride. Emily noticed everything. One afternoon, as she rested after practice, Emily asked quietly, "Do you ever get tired of being careful?" Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, thinking, "Careful keeps people safe," he said, "but fear dressed up as careful? That just keeps them small." She nodded, understanding more than he knew. That night, she dreamed of walking without thinking about it, of movement without calculation. She woke with sore muscles and a strange, steady joy. At home, Richard Stone noticed the changes. Emily's posture, her confidence, the way she no longer asked for help before standing. He asked questions. She answered selectively. Suspicion crept in where certainty used to live. One evening, Richard watched his daughter cross the room without her cane, her steps slow but deliberate, his heart twisted with equal parts pride and fear. Control had always been his answer. Now it felt insufficient. Back in the garage, Marcus watched Emily take another careful step, sunlight catching the dust in the air. He felt the weight of something growing between them, unspoken but undeniable. He reminded himself of boundaries, of distance, of the many reasons this path was dangerous. Still, when Emily smiled at him, steady on her feet, he couldn't deny the truth settling quietly into his bones. Some connections weren't chosen, they were recognized. Neither of them knew it yet, but the fragile balance they had built was already being watched, measured, and judged from afar. And when it finally tipped, it would do so with a force neither patience nor caution could stop. The night Richard Stone decided to tighten the boundaries around his daughter's life, Emily felt it before a single word was spoken. It came in small, unmistakable changes. Her driver's schedule shifted without explanation. Appointments appeared on her calendar she hadn't agreed to. The familiar freedom of slipping out quietly, of choosing when and where her day unfolded, began to close like a door drawn slowly but firmly shut. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Control, when practiced long enough, became almost invisible. Emily sat at the long dining table that evening, the one designed for entertaining people who never stayed long enough to see how lonely the house could be. A perfectly plated meal cooled in front of her. Across the table, Richard folded his napkin with deliberate precision, his movements calm, rehearsed. "You've been improving," he said, not looking at her. "Your therapists are pleased," Emily nodded. "I've been working hard, I can see that." He took a sip of water, then set the glass down carefully. "Which is why I've made a few adjustments. For your safety." Her fingers tightened around her fork. "What kind of adjustments?" "No more unscheduled outings," Richard replied. "No more detours. Your driver will follow the routes we agree on. And I've canceled your remaining appointments in that part of town." Emily met his gaze. "East Austin?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That place is not appropriate for you." "For me," she repeated softly. "Or, for you." He sighed, as if disappointed. "This isn't a debate, Emily. You're vulnerable. People see that. They take advantage." "Marcus didn't," she said before she could stop herself. The name landed between them like a dropped plate. Richard's eyes hardened. "So you admit it. You've been seeing him. I've been talking to him, Emily said. Learning, healing. He's a mechanic, Richard snapped. He has no training, no credentials, no business involving himself in your recovery. Emily pushed her chair back slightly, the scrape of wood against stone echoing in the room. He listened to me. That's more than most of them did. Richard stood, pacing now. Listening isn't treatment, and intentions don't protect you from consequences. Emily rose carefully, bracing herself on the table before straightening. You think money protects me from consequences? Look at me. Silence fell, heavy and brittle. Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and for a moment the fear he carried cracked through the armor. He had lost her once already, on a rain-slicked highway with flashing lights and twisted metal. He could not lose her again. Not to hope, not to a man he couldn't control. This ends now, he said quietly. You will not go back there. Emily swallowed, the familiar ache returning to her chest. I never got to thank him. Richard turned away. You don't owe him anything. But she did. She felt it like a weight, like an unfinished sentence pressing against her ribs. That night, as the house settled around her, Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in the garage. The patience in Marcus's voice. The way he stepped back instead of forward. The respect and restraint. Gratitude had a way of becoming something sharper when denied expression. It cut inward. Across town, Marcus Reed finished closing up his garage under a sky streaked with orange and violet. He had noticed Emily's absence immediately. Her visits had become part of the rhythm of his days, a quiet counterpoint to the clatter of tools and engines. When 2 days passed without her, he told himself not to read into it. When a week passed, he felt the absence like a missing note in a familiar song. He never called. He never asked around. He knew better. People like Emily lived in worlds with walls you couldn't see until you ran into them. Marcus respected those walls, even when they hurt. Still, he found himself thinking of her as he worked. He remembered the chalk marks on the floor where she'd measured her progress, the careful pride in her eyes when she erased one and moved it farther. He remembered the way she laughed, startled by her own joy. Some nights, as he sat with his mother on the small porch behind their house, he caught himself staring out toward the tracks, listening for a train that never came. Emily's body remembered even when her schedule did not allow her to act. In the privacy of her room, she practiced the exercises Marcus had shown her, replaying his words in her mind. Shift your weight, trust the ground, let your body lead. Some days, she succeeded, other days, she failed. She kept going anyway. Gratitude became fuel. It kept her moving when fear threatened to pin her in place. Richard watched these changes with growing unease. He noticed her strength, her determination, and misunderstood both. To him, independence was a threat, not a triumph. He began asking questions. He reviewed security footage. He spoke to drivers and assistants in tones that discouraged honesty. Patterns emerged. Routes repeated. Stops lingered. One afternoon, Richard stood alone in his study, looking out over the city he had helped build. He prided himself on foresight, on seeing risks before they materialized, and yet he had missed something fundamental. His daughter was changing in ways he could not control. That frightened him more than any financial downturn ever had. Meanwhile, Marcus received an unexpected visit of his own. A man from a neighboring shop stopped by, leaning against the doorframe with a wary look. You should be careful, he muttered. Word is someone's asking questions about you. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What kind of questions? The man shrugged. The kind that come with money. Marcus thanked him and went back to work, but the warning settled in his gut. He had lived long enough to recognize the early signs of trouble. Attention, once attracted, rarely arrived alone. That evening, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, her braces resting unused against the wall. She flexed her feet, feeling the strength there, earned through effort and trust. She whispered the words she hadn't been allowed to say. Thank you. They hung in the air, unanswered but necessary. In the dim light of his garage, Marcus turned off the radio and listened to the silence. He didn't know where Emily was or why she'd stopped coming. He only knew that whatever had drawn her away had done so with force. He reminded himself that some help was meant to be temporary, some connections brief. Even so, a quiet resolve settled over him. If their paths crossed again, he would be ready, and if they didn't, he would carry the knowledge that, for a moment, he had helped someone stand. Neither of them knew it yet, but the separation that now stretched between them was not an ending. It was a test, one that would demand more courage than either had already shown, and one that would force a powerful man to confront the difference between protection and possession. The second meeting came quietly, without raised voices or shattered expectations, and because of that, it changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday morning that felt almost merciful by Texas standards. The air was warm but not yet punishing. The sky washed clean after a night of brief, forgettable rain. Emily Stone had insisted on handling a small errand herself, something ordinary enough that her father hadn't objected, a stop at an auto parts store just south of downtown, a place she claimed was on the way back from a medical appointment. It was close enough to the truth to pass inspection. The driver waited by the entrance while Emily moved inside, her cane tapping softly against the concrete floor. The store smelled of rubber, oil, and cardboard, a scent that carried none of the antiseptic sterility she had grown used to. She moved slowly down the aisles, more careful than uncertain, her body still learning the balance she'd been denied for years. She paused near a rack of belts and hoses she didn't need, steadying herself with one hand on the shelf. That was when she heard it, a voice, low and even, explaining something without condescension. "You go with the reinforced belt," the man was saying. "Costs a little more, but you won't be back here in 6 months fixing the same problem." Emily recognized the voice before she turned. Her breath caught, just slightly. Marcus Reed stood a few feet away, holding a box in one hand while an older man in a faded baseball cap nodded along. Marcus looked exactly as he had in the garage, right down to the oil-stained cuffs of his shirt. He looked up mid-sentence, their eyes meeting across the narrow aisle. Surprise flickered across his face, followed quickly by recognition and something softer. He finished his thought. The older man thanked him and wandered off, leaving the two of them alone among shelves of parts and quiet hum of fluorescent lights. "Morning," Marcus said, his tone calm, unintrusive, as if he were greeting a neighbor rather than a memory he hadn't been sure he'd see again. "Morning," Emily replied. The word felt heavier than it should have, loaded with the gratitude she had carried for weeks. They stood there for a moment, neither rushing to fill the space. Marcus noticed she looked steadier, her weight distributed more evenly, her shoulders less tense. Emily noticed he hadn't stepped any closer than necessary. "I never got to thank you," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. Marcus shook his head once. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," she insisted. "You treated me like I was still capable." He studied her carefully, not out of curiosity but consideration. "You are capable," he said. "You've been hurt. That's not the same thing." Emily felt something loosen inside her, a knot she hadn't known how to untie. "I've been practicing," she admitted. "What you showed me, when I can." A hint of approval crossed Marcus's face before he caught himself. "That's how it works," he said. "Slow, consistent, no shortcuts." They talked then, easily, about nothing that would have raised alarms. Marcus mentioned work, parts getting more expensive, customers who waited too long to fix small problems. Emily spoke about therapy, about specialists who meant well but didn't listen closely enough. Neither mentioned her father, neither mentioned fear. When the driver appeared at the end of the aisle, checking his watch, Emily felt the moment slipping away. She hesitated, then said, "Would it be all right if I came by your shop sometime, just to talk?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He thought about boundaries, about scrutiny, about how easily intentions could be misread. Then he said, carefully, "That's your decision, not mine." Emily smiled, small and genuine. Then I'll decide. From that day forward, East Austin found its way back into Emily's life in quiet increments. Sometimes it was a deliberate choice, asking the driver for a longer route, a stop she framed as curiosity about the city she rarely saw. Other times, she went alone, claiming independence with a confidence that surprised even her. Marcus never invited her. He never turned her away. He simply made space. The garage changed when Emily was there. Marcus brought a folding chair closer to the open bay door so she could sit comfortably. The radio stayed low, a steady murmur of familiar songs. Conversation came without effort, unburdened by expectation. Marcus talked about growing up near the tracks, about learning early that respect wasn't something given freely. He talked about his father teaching him how to fix engines, and his mother teaching him how to endure people. Emily listened, absorbing not just his words but the steadiness behind them. She spoke about the accident, not with drama, but with honesty, about waking up in a hospital bed and realizing her body no longer responded the way it once had, about being surrounded by care that felt like confinement. Marcus didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions where none were asked for. Between conversations, he showed her small exercises, shifts of weight, subtle changes in posture. He never touched her without asking, and often he didn't touch her at all. "Your body needs to remember it's in charge," he told her once. "I'm just reminding it how." Emily began leaving her cane by the chair, practicing short distances without it. The first time she managed 3 steps unassisted, she laughed, startled by the sound of her own joy. Marcus looked away, giving her the dignity of the moment. Not everyone was blind to what was happening. A patrol car slowed once, the officer's gaze lingering before moving on. A neighboring shop owner muttered something under his breath. Marcus noticed. Emily noticed more. One afternoon, after a particularly good session, Emily rested on the chair, breathing evenly. "Do you ever get tired of being careful?" she asked. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, considering the question. "Careful keeps people safe," he said. "But fear, pretending to be careful? That just keeps them small." Emily nodded, understanding more than he realized. That night, she dreamed of walking without counting steps, of moving without calculation. She woke sore but smiling. At home, Richard Stone noticed the changes. Emily stood taller. She asked for less help. She moved through rooms with a confidence that unsettled him. He asked questions. She answered selectively. The control he relied on began to feel less certain. Back in the garage, Marcus watched Emily take another steady step, sunlight catching the dust in the air. He felt the weight of something forming between them, unspoken but undeniable. He reminded himself of distance, of caution, of all the reasons this connection was dangerous. Still, when Emily smiled at him, steady on her feet, he knew one truth with quiet certainty. Some meetings weren't accidents. They were corrections, setting lives back on paths that had been bent but not broken. By the time Emily realized the garage had become a place where she could breathe, it was already too late to pretend otherwise. It wasn't just the exercises or the progress, though both mattered. It was the absence of eyes that judged, the absence of voices that rushed her. Inside Marcus Reed's garage, time moved at a human pace. Cars came and went. Radios hummed. Tools clinked softly against metal. And in that ordinary rhythm, Emily found something she hadn't felt since before the accident. Privacy, without isolation. She began arriving earlier in the day, usually late morning, when the heat was still manageable, and Marcus's regulars had thinned out. He never asked why her visits had become more frequent. He never commented on the way she seemed lighter, more certain, each time she stepped through the open bay door. He simply adjusted the folding chair, cleared a small space on the concrete floor, and let the day unfold. On one of those mornings, Emily arrived without her cane. Marcus noticed immediately but said nothing. He had learned that pointing out progress too soon could make it fragile. Instead, he watched her walk the short distance from the entrance to the chair, her steps slow but deliberate, her arms relaxed at her sides. When she sat down, She let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "I didn't forget it," she said, answering the question he hadn't asked. "I just wanted to see if I could do it." "And?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice neutral. "And I did," she said, her eyes bright. "It wasn't perfect, but it was mine." He nodded once. "That's the part that counts." They worked that day without much conversation. Marcus adjusted an engine mount, while Emily practiced standing and shifting her weight, focusing on balance rather than distance. The radio played softly in the background, a familiar song about roads that never quite led where you expected. Every so often, Marcus glanced over, not to supervise but to be present. When Emily faltered, he didn't rush in. He waited. More often than not, she corrected herself. "This place," Emily said later, resting on the chair, "it feels different from the clinic." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag. "Clinics fix problems," he said. "Places like this, they give you room." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Outside the garage, the world remained less forgiving. Emily had begun to notice things she hadn't before. The way people slowed their steps when they saw her, uncertain whether to offer help or avert their eyes. The way Marcus's customers sometimes looked past him, assuming authority lay elsewhere. She watched a police cruiser idle across the street one afternoon, the officer inside glancing toward the garage longer than necessary before driving on. Marcus didn't react. Emily did. "Does that happen a lot?" she asked quietly. Marcus followed her gaze. "Enough," he said. "You get used to it." She frowned. "You shouldn't have to." He smiled faintly. "Shouldn't is a nice word. Doesn't change much." The garage, for all its quiet, was not invisible. Neighbors noticed Emily's presence. Some watched with curiosity, others with suspicion. A man from the tire shop next door muttered once about trouble finding trouble. Marcus heard it. He ignored it, but he began locking the office door more carefully, double-checking that nothing could be misinterpreted or used against him. Boundaries mattered. Protection, real protection, was quiet and consistent. Emily felt the shift as well. She became more discreet, parking farther away when she came alone, timing her visits to avoid attention. The secrecy unsettled her, but it also sharpened her sense of purpose. This wasn't rebellion. It was preservation. One afternoon, as they sat side by side drinking lukewarm coffee from mismatched mugs, Emily asked, "Did you ever think about leaving, starting over somewhere else?" Marcus considered the question. "Thought about it," he said. "Didn't do it." "Why not?" He gestured around the garage. "Because this place needs me, and because running doesn't always mean moving forward." Emily absorbed that, turning the mug slowly in her hands. "My father thinks control is the same as safety." Marcus looked at her then. Really looked. "Control feels safer to the person holding it," he said, "not always to the one living under it." The words settled between them, heavy but true. Emily thought of the estate, the schedules, the well-meaning restrictions that felt increasingly suffocating. She thought of the way her father watched her now, measuring her movements with a mixture of pride and fear. She didn't blame him, but she couldn't let his fear become her future. Her progress continued, steady and undeniable. She began walking the length of the garage without stopping, then back again. Marcus marked nothing on the floor this time. Emily didn't need the proof. Her body knew. At home, Richard Stone noticed everything. He saw the absence of the cane. He heard the confidence in her voice when she spoke. He reviewed footage from security cameras and noticed patterns he hadn't wanted to see. Routes that bent toward East Austin, stops that lasted longer than errands required. His concern hardened into suspicion. One evening, as Emily crossed the living room without assistance, Richard rose abruptly from his chair. "Where have you been learning to do that?" Emily met his gaze calmly. "By paying attention," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have," she replied. Richard turned away, his mind already working. He made calls. He asked questions that didn't sound like accusations. Information came back slowly. pieced together from drivers, assistants, fragments of routine. A name surfaced more than once. Marcus Reed, a mechanic. East Austin. Richard felt anger, then something sharper beneath it. Fear, not of Marcus Reed himself, but of what he represented. A loss of control. A world his daughter was stepping into without him. Back in the garage, Marcus felt the pressure building, though he couldn't yet name its source. He sensed eyes where there had been none before. Questions that lingered in the air after customers left. He said nothing to Emily, unwilling to burden her progress with his concerns. Instead, he reinforced the rules he'd always lived by. Transparency, distance, respect. Late one afternoon, as Emily prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "If this becomes a problem for you," she said, her voice careful, "you should tell me." Marcus met her eyes. "I will," he said, "but don't borrow trouble that hasn't arrived yet." She smiled, grateful. As she walked away, steady and unassisted, Marcus felt a quiet pride mixed with unease. The garage had given her room to grow. Now, it was drawing attention, and attention, he knew, was rarely neutral. Neither of them spoke the truth, forming beneath their careful words, that the place where Emily felt most free was also the place where the balance of power in her life was beginning to shift. And when balance shifted, someone always noticed. By the 7th week, silence had become its own language between Emily Stone and Marcus Reed. It lived in the pauses before she took a step, in the way Marcus watched without hovering, in the mutual understanding that not everything needed to be spoken to be known. What had begun as careful instruction had settled into something quieter and more complex. Emily no longer came to the garage only to heal her body. She came because, within those oil-stained walls, she felt allowed to exist without explanation. The first time she walked the length of the garage without stopping, Marcus didn't say a word. He pretended to focus on a stubborn bolt, giving her the space to finish the moment on her own terms. When she reached the far wall and turned back toward him, her eyes shone with disbelief and pride tangled together. "I didn't think about it," she said softly. "I just walked." "That's usually how it happens," Marcus replied. "The thinking gets out of the way." Emily laughed, a low, surprised sound. It felt good to laugh without immediately bracing for pain. She sat down on the folding chair, breathing evenly, and let the silence settle. It didn't feel awkward anymore. It felt earned. They talked less about recovery now, and more about everything else. Marcus told her about his father, a man who had believed in fixing what you could reach with your own hands and accepting what you couldn't. He spoke about losing him too early, about inheriting the garage along with debts no one else wanted. Emily listened, absorbing the weight behind the words. She shared memories of her life before the accident, college plans interrupted, friendships that faded when her world slowed down, the strange loneliness of being constantly surrounded by people who worried about her. "Sometimes," she admitted one afternoon, "I think they miss the version of me that didn't need anything." Marcus leaned against the workbench, considering that. "People like simple stories," he said, "before and after, strong and weak. They don't know what to do with in-between." Emily nodded. She lived in the in-between now. It was where she was rebuilding herself, piece by piece, without permission. As the weeks passed, the garage became a quiet refuge. The chalk marks Marcus once used to track her progress were gone, washed away by time and dust. Emily no longer needed proof on the floor. Her body told the story clearly enough. She began walking without braces during practice, her movements cautious but increasingly confident. Marcus never pushed her. He trusted her instincts. Trust, she learned, was more powerful than encouragement. But silence had another edge. It hid what they both felt and what neither was ready to name. Marcus noticed the way Emily lingered after practice, reluctant to leave even when her body was tired. He noticed the way she listened when he spoke, not just to his words but to the spaces between them. He noticed how her presence altered the garage, softening it without changing its bones. He also noticed the looks from passing drivers, the subtle shift in the neighborhood's attention. He had lived his life navigating other people's assumptions. Now, those assumptions brushed dangerously close to someone he cared about. Emily noticed his restraint, the way he never touched her unless she asked, the way he stepped back when a step forward might have been misread. She recognized it for what it was. Respect layered with caution, shaped by a world that rarely offered black men the benefit of the doubt. That understanding deepened her feelings, complicating them in ways she didn't yet have words for. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the concrete, Emily stood near the open bay door, watching dust drift through the light. "Do you ever wish people could just see what's actually happening?" she asked. Marcus followed her gaze. "Sometimes," he said, "but most of the time, I settle for knowing it myself. That seems lonely." He shrugged. Loneliness and peace look a lot alike from the outside. Emily thought about that long after she left. At home, Richard Stone's unease had hardened into resolve. He no longer asked questions, he gathered information. He studied his daughter the way he studied markets, searching for patterns, risks, leverage. He saw her walking more freely, her posture stronger, her eyes brighter. Instead of relief, he felt threatened. Something outside his control was shaping her future, and he did not yet know how to stop it. One evening, he reviewed footage from a security feed, watching Emily cross the driveway without assistance. He paused the screen, zoomed in, and stared. The braces were gone. His breath caught, equal parts awe and dread. He made a call, his voice calm, measured. "I need to know where she's been going," he said, "and who she's been seeing." Back in East Austin, Marcus felt the shift before it arrived. A patrol car idled across the street one afternoon, engine running, officer inside pretending to check a phone. Marcus met his gaze briefly, then returned to his work. He had nothing to hide, but he knew how little that sometimes mattered. He made sure the garage stayed open, visible, honest in every detail. Transparency was his shield. Emily sensed the tension when she arrived the next day. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. Marcus didn't deny it. "Attention has a way of finding things," he replied, "even when you don't invite it." "Is it because of me?" He hesitated, then answered truthfully, "It might be." Emily swallowed. "If this puts you at risk," Marcus shook his head gently, "I decide what risks I take." She looked at him, gratitude and worry mixing in her expression. "I don't want to be another thing you have to carry." "You're not," he said. "You're a person who showed up and did the work. That matters." They sat in silence again, heavier this time. Emily stood, walked a few steps, turned back, and walked farther, proving to herself that the progress was real, not borrowed. Marcus watched, pride tightening his chest. As she left that day, Emily paused at the edge of the lot. "Whatever happens," she said, "I won't pretend this didn't matter." Marcus met her eyes. "Neither will I." She walked away without her cane, steady and unassisted, disappearing down the sidewalk toward a world that was already closing in. Marcus stood in the doorway of his garage, hands at his sides, understanding with quiet certainty that the calm they had built was temporary. Silence had given them space to grow. Soon, it would be replaced by noise, confrontation, and truths no one could ignore. And somewhere beyond the tracks, a powerful man was preparing to reclaim control, unaware that the ground beneath his certainty had already begun to shift. The evidence, to him, was everywhere. Emily no longer asked for assistance when standing. She crossed rooms with a measured confidence that unsettled him. Her posture had changed, her movements quieter, more assured. Even her silences were different now. They were not empty, they were chosen. That frightened him more than open rebellion ever could. He began with questions that sounded harmless. A comment here, a casual observation there. "Your balance looks better," he said one evening, watching her move from the sofa to the window without hesitation. "What did the therapists say?" Emily didn't look at him. "They said progress isn't linear." Richard frowned. It was a practiced phrase, one he'd heard from doctors before, but it wasn't how she said it. It wasn't borrowed. It was owned. That night, after Emily retired to her room, Richard stood alone in his study, city lights spreading beneath him like a controlled fire. He replayed the last few weeks in his mind, lining up details the way he did financial statements. Routes taken, appointments canceled, the missing cane, the braces left unused more often than not. Patterns emerged, subtle but unmistakable. He called the driver first, not with accusations, with concern. "I want to make sure Emily's routine hasn't been too taxing," he said calmly. "You've noticed how much stronger she's gotten." The driver hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Richard pressed gently. The truth came in fragments, longer routes, unscheduled stops, a neighborhood near the tracks, East Austin. Richard ended the call without comment and sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. East Austin was not part of his world. It was a place he passed over, not through, and yet, something there was changing his daughter in ways he had not sanctioned. He made another call, this time to an assistant whose job was to know things before they became problems. "I want information," he said. "On a mechanic. Name's Marcus Reed. Works near the railroad tracks." The assistant didn't ask why. That was why Richard paid him well. Meanwhile, Emily felt the walls closing in. She noticed the way her father watched her now, his gaze lingering a fraction longer than necessary. She sensed the tension in the house, the quiet recalibration of control. Her phone buzzed less often with spontaneous plans. Schedules tightened. Freedom shrank. She considered telling Marcus. The thought surfaced more than once, especially on mornings when she felt the weight of secrecy pressing down on her chest. But she held back. She didn't want to burden him with her father's fear. She didn't want to be the reason his world grew more dangerous. Marcus, for his part, felt the shift as well. It came in the form of unfamiliar cars slowing near the garage, of glances that lingered too long. A man in a suit stood across the street one afternoon, pretending to check his phone while clearly observing the building. Marcus kept working, his movements precise, unhurried. He had learned long ago that panic drew attention faster than truth. Still, he took precautions. He cleaned the garage more thoroughly. He made sure everything was visible, above board. He reminded himself of his boundaries, of the lines he would not cross no matter how strong the pull. He thought of Emily's steady steps, her growing independence, and felt both pride and concern twist together inside him. The assistant's report arrived 2 days later. Richard read it alone. Marcus Reed, 35, local business owner, no criminal record, known in the community for fair prices and quiet generosity. Nothing scandalous, nothing dangerous, and yet the unease remained. What kind of man gains this much influence without asking for anything in return? Richard murmured to himself. He closed the file and stared out the window again. Influence without leverage was something he didn't understand. It didn't fit his worldview. That made it suspect. That evening, he confronted Emily directly. Not with anger, with disappointment, which he knew cut deeper. "You've been going places you didn't tell me about," he said, his voice even. Emily met his gaze, her expression calm. "I didn't lie. You withheld," Richard replied. "That's not the same thing." She took a breath. "I needed space." "And you found it with him," Richard said, the name unspoken but heavy in the air. Emily didn't deny it. "I found it with someone who listens." Richard's face hardened. "Listening doesn't make him safe." Emily stepped forward, steady on her feet. "Neither does control." The words hung between them, irreparable now that they had been spoken. Richard felt something shift inside him, a fracture he had avoided acknowledging. His daughter was no longer asking, she was asserting. "This ends," he said quietly. "You will stop seeing him." Emily shook her head, just slightly. "You don't get to decide that anymore." Silence followed, thick and dangerous. Richard turned away first. He knew escalation when he felt it. He also knew when to change tactics. The next morning, he canceled a meeting and took the car himself. No driver, no entourage. just a man and his certainty. East Austin was farther than he remembered, the city changing as he crossed invisible lines. Buildings grew older, streets narrower. People watched him as he drove, his presence as out of place as the SUV he no longer bothered to hide. He found the garage easily. Reed Auto, faded sign, an American flag worn thin but still hanging. Richard parked across the street and sat for a moment, watching. Marcus was inside, working. A woman passed by, waved. He waved back. The garage looked ordinary, honest. That irritated Richard more than anything else. He stepped out of the car and crossed the street, his footsteps deliberate. Marcus noticed him immediately. Their eyes met. Recognition sparked, followed by understanding. This was not a customer. Richard stopped just outside the open bay door. He took in the tools, the radio, the space where his daughter had learned to stand. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled. Marcus Reed. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and nodded once. That's me. We need to talk, Richard said. Marcus didn't invite him in. He didn't tell him to leave. He simply stood where he was, grounded, present. About what? Richard's gaze sharpened. About my daughter. The air shifted, charged with everything that had been building for weeks. Somewhere behind Marcus, a train horn sounded in the distance, low and mournful. Marcus held Richard's gaze, understanding with quiet clarity that the calm they had shared with Emily was over. What came next would not be gentle, and it would not be avoidable. Richard Stone didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Standing at the edge of the garage, he carried the kind of authority that expected the world to bend without being told. Marcus Reed recognized it immediately. He had seen it before, in different forms, usually right before things turned complicated. You've been spending time with my daughter, Richard said, his tone precise, almost clinical. I want to understand why. Marcus folded the rag in his hands and set it on the workbench. He kept his posture open, his feet planted firmly on the concrete. Emily comes here on her own, he replied. I don't make her do anything. That's not an answer, Richard said. You're influencing her. Marcus met his gaze. I listen to her. Richard's jaw tightened. Listening is not harmless, especially when you don't understand the consequences. I understand them better than you think, Marcus said quietly. The words hung in the air, sharp enough to cut. Richard glanced around the garage, taking in the tools, the oil stains, the open bay door that offered no secrets. It irritated him. He had expected defensiveness. He had expected excuses. Calm unsettled him. You're not qualified to help her, Richard said. You're not trained. You're not accountable. And yet somehow, she's changed. That tells me you're doing something you shouldn't. Marcus took a slow breath. He thought of Emily's first unassisted steps, the way she had smiled without fear. I'm not treating her, he said. I'm not replacing her doctors. I'm giving her space to trust her body again. Richard shook his head. That's not your role. Marcus's voice remained steady. It's not yours either. The shift was immediate. Richard's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. You're crossing a line. No, Marcus said. I'm respecting one. For a moment, neither spoke. The train horn sounded again in the distance. Closer now, the vibration rattling faintly through the tools on the wall. Richard glanced toward the sound, then back at Marcus. You have no idea what she's been through. Marcus felt something stir in his chest, an old anger tempered by years of restraint. I know what it's like to lose control of your body, he said. And I know what it's like when people decide your fear matters more than your future. Richard scoffed. You're projecting. Maybe, Marcus replied. Or maybe I'm paying attention. Richard stepped closer, invading the space Marcus had deliberately kept clear. This ends today, he said. You will stop seeing her. Marcus didn't move. That's her decision. Richard's voice sharpened. You think I won't protect my daughter? Marcus looked at him then, really looked, and spoke with a quiet certainty that surprised them both. I think you're afraid of losing control. And you're calling it protection. The words landed hard. Richard felt them, felt the truth in them, and rejected it instantly. He straightened, the mask sliding back into place. "You're done," he said. "If you care about her at all, you'll stay away." He turned and walked back toward his car without waiting for a response. Marcus watched him go, his chest tight, his instincts warning him that this was far from over. Power rarely retreated gracefully. Across town, Emily sat in her room, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor. She had felt the tension all day, a low hum beneath her thoughts. When her phone buzzed, her heart jumped. It was her father. "We need to talk," the message read. "I'm coming to get you." Emily stared at the screen, dread pooling in her stomach. She stood, walked to the window, and watched the city breathe below her. She knew what was coming. She also knew what she would do. When Richard arrived, he didn't ask. He didn't argue. He told her to get in the car. Emily complied, her movements steady, deliberate. She didn't reach for her cane. She didn't look back at the house. The drive was silent at first, the city unfolding around them in layers of glass and steel giving way to older streets. Emily recognized the route almost immediately. "You're taking me to the garage," she said. Richard's hands tightened on the wheel. "You need to see this for yourself." "What?" Emily asked. "That he's dangerous? That he's using me? That he's inappropriate," Richard replied. "That he's crossed boundaries." Emily shook her head. "You're wrong." Richard didn't respond. He didn't need to. He believed the truth would reveal itself once she saw him through his eyes. They arrived just as the sun dipped low, the light slanting across the lot. Marcus stood near the bay door, finishing up with a customer. He looked up as the SUV pulled in, recognition flashing across his face, followed by concern when he saw Emily step out beside her father. "Emily," he said, his voice careful. She walked toward him without hesitation. No cane, no braces, just her own strength carrying her forward. Richard stopped short, his breath catching despite himself. He had seen her walk before. He had not seen this, not like this. "She did this," Emily said, gesturing to herself. "With help, not control." Richard stared, his certainty wavering for the first time. "You're putting her at risk," he said to Marcus, but the conviction had weakened. Marcus didn't respond to the accusation. He watched Emily, ensuring she was steady, letting her take the lead. "She's stronger than you think," he said simply. Emily turned to her father, her voice calm but unyielding. "You wanted to protect me. I understand that. But you don't get to decide how I heal." Silence fell, thick and disorienting. Richard felt it press in on him, felt the ground beneath his certainty begin to shift. He looked at his daughter, really looked, and saw not fragility but resolve. The realization hit him harder than any confrontation could have. He took a step back, the first retreat he had made in years. "I didn't know," he said quietly. Emily met his gaze. "You didn't ask." The words cut deeper than anger ever could. Richard swallowed, his throat tight. He looked at Marcus, at the man he had dismissed, and saw not a threat but a mirror reflecting his own fear. For the first time, he questioned whether control had ever been the same as care. The train passed then, close enough to shake the ground, its roar filling the space between them. When it faded, nothing was the same. Richard stood in the open lot, stripped of certainty, facing a truth he could no longer deny. And Marcus, grounded and steady, understood that this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would demand more courage than any of them had yet shown. Richard Stone stood very still as the last car pulled out of the lot, its engine noise fading into the late afternoon hush. The garage felt different now that the train had passed, quieter but heavier, as if the air itself were waiting. Emily stood a few feet in front of him, balanced easily on her own feet, her shoulders relaxed, her weight centered in a way he had not seen since before the accident. Marcus remained near the open bay door, deliberately distant, his hands visible, his posture neutral. He was not the focus of the moment. Emily was. "Walk again," Richard said, before he could stop himself. It wasn't an order. It was a request disguised as one. Emily met his eyes. There was no defiance there, no triumph either, only calm. "All right," she said. She took a step, then another. Slow, controlled, but unmistakably her own. No brace, no cane, no hesitation born of fear. Richard felt something inside his chest tighten sharply, a physical sensation that surprised him with its intensity. He had prepared himself for many possibilities when he drove here. Deception, manipulation, recklessness. What he had not prepared for was competence. Quiet, undeniable competence. "How long?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Have you been able to do this?" Emily paused, considering. "Longer than you think," she said gently. "Shorter than I wish." Richard looked past her then, to Marcus. "You did this," he said, the accusation already losing its edge. Marcus shook his head. "She did," he replied. "I just made sure she had room to try." That answer unsettled Richard more than any argument could have. He turned back to his daughter, watching the way she shifted her weight naturally, the way her body responded to itself instead of fighting against rigid instruction. He saw now what he had missed before. Not a miracle, but a method. Not force, but trust. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked Emily. She held his gaze. "You never asked me how I wanted to heal," she said. "You asked everyone else." The words landed with a dull thud, not loud but final. Richard felt the familiar impulse to defend himself, rise up, armed with reasons and intentions. He had spared no expense. He had consulted the best specialists. He had built schedules and safeguards and contingencies. But standing there, watching his daughter stand on her own, those defenses felt suddenly hollow. He took a step forward, then stopped himself. He remembered the way Marcus had stopped. Weeks ago. Hands raised, respecting a boundary even as fear shouted at him to intervene. Richard felt a flicker of shame at the memory. "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "I know. And I failed," he added, the admission tasting bitter and strange. "No," she said. "You just protected the wrong thing." Richard exhaled slowly. He felt older in that moment than he had in years. The garage around them seemed to pulse with life he had overlooked at first glance. Tools neatly arranged, chalk smudges on the floor from past measurements, a radio murmuring softly in the background. This place had not healed his daughter by accident. It had done so because someone had paid attention. Richard turned to Marcus. The anger he had carried with him had nowhere to land now. "You could have taken advantage," he said. "Of her, of me." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "I could have," he agreed. "I didn't." "Why?" Richard asked. It was an honest question, stripped of suspicion. Marcus considered him for a moment. "Because trust isn't something you use," he said. "It's something you protect." Richard felt the truth of that settle heavily in his chest. He nodded once, slowly. "I was wrong," he said. The words surprised him with how much they cost to say. He looked at Emily, then back at Marcus. "About you. About this." Emily stepped closer to her father, placing a steadying hand on his arm. The role reversal was not lost on either of them. "You didn't see him," she said. "You saw your fear." Richard closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was moisture there he did not bother to hide. He had built a life on never being caught unprepared, and yet here he was, undone by the sight of his daughter walking across a concrete floor. "I don't know how to make this right," he said. Emily squeezed his arm. "You already started," she replied. "By seeing me." They stood like that for a moment. Father and daughter, the distance between them shrinking in ways no schedule could measure. Marcus remained where he was, giving them space, understanding instinctively that this was not his conversation to lead. When Richard finally turned back to him, his voice was steadier. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for assuming the worst, for treating you like a threat." Marcus inclined his head slightly. "I understand why you did," he said. "Fear makes people loud." Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. And blind. Yes, Marcus agreed. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lot. Emily walked a few more steps, then stopped, resting comfortably without reaching for support. Richard watched her, committing the image to memory, not because he feared losing it, but because he knew he had nearly missed it altogether. "I won't interfere anymore," Richard said finally. "Not like before." Emily looked at him closely. "I don't need permission," she said, "but I want your respect." He nodded. "You have it." There were still questions left unanswered, still tension humming beneath the surface. Years of control did not dissolve in a single afternoon, but something fundamental had shifted. The ground Richard stood on no longer felt as solid as it once had, and for the first time, that felt like progress. As they prepared to leave, Emily turned back to Marcus. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had gone unsaid before. Marcus smiled, just slightly. "You're welcome." Richard watched the exchange, seeing it now without suspicion. He understood, at last, that what had happened here was not a loss of authority, but a gain of truth. And as he walked back to his car beside his daughter, he knew that the reckoning he had feared was not an ending. It was an invitation to become something better than he had been. The change did not announce itself with headlines or apologies made for an audience. It arrived quietly, the way real reckonings often do, and it unsettled Richard Stone far more than confrontation ever had. That night, after leaving the garage, he drove without speaking. Emily beside him, the city sliding past in softened streaks of light. He kept replaying the image of her walking across that concrete floor, unassisted, unafraid, uncontained. It followed him into the house, into his study, into the long hours before sleep finally came. For the first time since the accident, his thoughts were not consumed by contingency plans or worst-case scenarios. They were fixed on a single, uncomfortable truth. His daughter had healed in spite of him, not because of him. Emily felt the shift as well. The house did not feel smaller that night. It felt quieter, as if something heavy had been set down at last. Her father did not issue instructions. He did not revise her schedule or summon advisors. He asked one question instead, standing at the doorway of her room with a hesitation she had never seen before. "Are you in pain?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Not tonight." Richard nodded, as if committing the answer to memory. "If that changes," he said, "you tell me." "I will," she replied. And she meant it. The next morning, Richard canceled a meeting he had spent weeks preparing for. He sat alone at his desk, staring at a blank legal pad, pen resting unused in his hand. He thought about power, about how easily it had come to him in business, how natural it had felt to apply it everywhere else. He thought about the word protection and how often it had been used to justify fear. He thought about Marcus Reed standing calmly in that garage, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to disappear. By noon, Richard had made a decision. Marcus Reed noticed the black sedan before it reached the garage. He was tightening a bolt when the car slowed, then stopped just short of the bay door. His muscles tensed instinctively, though his face remained neutral. He wiped his hands and waited. Richard stepped out alone this time. No driver, no entourage, just a man in a suit that looked less imposing in daylight. He stopped a few feet from Marcus, far enough to respect space, close enough to be heard over the hum of the radio. "I came to speak with you," Richard said. "Not as a father, as a man who was wrong." Marcus studied him carefully. Apologies were rare currency. "Go on," he said. Richard took a breath. It was shallow, imperfect. "I judged you," he said. "I assumed intention where there was none. I let my fear turn into accusation, and I treated you with disrespect." Marcus waited. Silence, he had learned, often invited honesty. "I've built my life on control," Richard continued. "It served me well, but it blinded me, to my daughter, and to you." His voice tightened, but he pressed on. "You gave her something I couldn't, trust." Marcus nodded once. She earned it. Yes, Richard agreed. She did. He met Marcus's gaze directly now. I'm sorry. The words hung there, unembellished. Marcus felt their weight. He had not expected this, not truly. I accept, he said. For what it's worth. Richard nodded, relief flickering across his face. There's more, he said. I don't want this to end with words, he explained then, briefly and without fanfare. A fund, quietly established. No press release, no naming rights. A workshop dedicated to mobility and rehabilitation, focused on access rather than prestige. He wanted Marcus to be involved, not as an employee, not as a figurehead, but as a partner if he chose. Marcus listened, expression unreadable. When Richard finished, he shook his head. I don't want control, Marcus said, and I won't be a symbol. I wouldn't ask you to be, Richard replied. I want to fix what I can without breaking something else. Marcus considered that. He thought of the people who came through his garage every day, of the quiet dignity that held their lives together. I'll think about it, he said. On my terms. That's fair, Richard said. When Emily arrived later that afternoon, she found them standing a respectful distance apart, talking like equals. The sight made her pause. Her father saw her first. He didn't wave her over. He waited. She walked toward them, steady and unassisted. Everything okay? She asked. Richard nodded. Yes, he said. We were just finishing. Marcus smiled at her. Warmth there, but no claim. You look strong today, he said. I feel strong, she replied. The three of them stood there for a moment, the weight of the past week settling into something quieter. Emily looked at her father. Thank you, she said. For what? Richard asked. For listening, she replied. Finally, he nodded, accepting the truth of it. I'm still learning. Emily turned to Marcus. So am I. They parted without ceremony. No declarations, no promises. But something fundamental had changed. The threat that had once hovered over the garage receded, replaced by a fragile, hard-earned respect. That evening, Richard stood at his window again, city lights stretching out below. For the first time, they did not feel like proof of conquest. They felt like responsibility. He understood now that justice did not always come with rules or titles. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, wearing grease-stained hands and refusing to step forward when stepping back was the right thing to do. At the garage, Marcus closed up shop and sat for a moment in the silence. He thought about the offer, about Emily, about the careful line he continued to walk. He knew better than to rush anything. Some good things grew only when left alone. Across town, Emily lay in bed, muscles sore in the best possible way. She stared at the ceiling and smiled, thinking not of what she had lost, but of what she had reclaimed. Her future no longer felt like a negotiation between fear and hope. It felt, finally, like her own. None of them knew exactly what came next. But for the first time, they were facing it without illusion, without dominance, and without turning away. And that, Emily thought as sleep found her, was what real healing looked like. The weeks that followed did not transform anyone overnight. They softened edges, shifted habits, and allowed space where there had once been pressure. Change arrived the way it often does in real lives, uneven, imperfect, and unmistakable once it settled. Emily returned to the garage openly now, no longer slipping around corners or timing her visits to avoid notice. She still chose quiet hours, not out of fear but preference. The place remained what it had always been, practical, honest, unconcerned with appearances. What changed was how it felt. The tension that once hummed beneath the surface was gone, replaced by something steadier. Respect had a way of doing that. Marcus noticed the difference immediately. He did not change how he spoke to Emily or how he guided her work. He kept the same boundaries, the same restraint, but the weight he had carried, the awareness that every step could be misread, every gesture questioned, had eased. He could breathe again. And breathing, he knew, mattered. Emily's progress continued, no longer measured in cautious victories but in ordinary moments that once felt impossible. She walked the length of the garage and back without thinking. She stood through conversations instead of sitting through them. She began to move the way she once had, not identically, but confidently, adapting rather than resisting. The braces stayed in her car now, untouched. She kept them not as a safety net, but as a reminder of where she had been. One afternoon, Richard Stone arrived without ceremony, parking where anyone else would, stepping into the garage without announcing himself. Marcus looked up from his work, surprised but not alarmed. Richard nodded, acknowledging the space, the people in it. He did not interrupt. Emily noticed him only after she finished an exercise and turned to rest. Their eyes met. There was no tension this time, no warning bells, just recognition. "I didn't want to interfere," Richard said later, his voice low. "I just wanted to see." Emily smiled. "Then you did it right." He watched her walk, watched the way Marcus observed without controlling, and felt something settle inside him. Not pride alone. Responsibility. The kind that asked more questions than it answered. The workshop came together quietly. No press, no announcements. The paperwork was handled by people who knew how to keep names out of headlines. The building was modest, practical, and close enough to the garage that Marcus could walk between them. He agreed to consult, not to lead. He trained others the way his father had trained him, patiently, without ego, with an emphasis on listening before fixing. People came, veterans with worn joints, workers with injuries that insurance had stopped caring about, young people who had learned early that systems were not built with them in mind. They came because someone told them there was a place where comfort was treated as a right, not a reward. Marcus never took credit. He didn't need to. He saw it in the way people stood a little taller when they left. Emily began volunteering there when she could, not as a symbol, not as a success story, but as a person who understood what it meant to start over. She listened, she encouraged. She shared when asked and stayed quiet when that was better. She did not pretend healing was simple. She knew better. The relationship between her and Marcus changed too, though neither rushed to define it. It lived in shared glances, in conversations that drifted longer than necessary, in a familiarity that did not demand more than it offered. They were careful, aware of the distance still between their worlds. Age, history, power. None of it disappeared simply because respect had entered the room. They honored those realities rather than denying them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft oranges and golds, Emily and Marcus walked together along the edge of the lot. Not practicing, just walking. Their steps matched naturally, unforced. They spoke about small things, the weather, a song on the radio, a memory that surfaced without warning. "I don't feel like I'm catching up anymore," Emily said, after a while. "I feel like I'm moving forward." Marcus nodded. "That's the difference between being pushed and being ready." She glanced at him, curiosity and something warmer mingling in her eyes. "And you?" she asked. "Are you ready for whatever comes next?" He considered the question, honest as always. "I don't rush what matters," he said. "But I don't walk away from it either." Emily smiled, satisfied. That was enough. Across town, Richard Stone stood at a window once more, but the city below no longer felt like proof of conquest. It felt like a community he was still learning how to belong to. He had redirected resources quietly, supported without dominating, and listened more than he spoke. He knew he would stumble again. Control was a hard habit to break, but he also knew the difference now between protection and possession, and that knowledge changed how he held the people he loved. Months later, a small sign went up near the workshop entrance. It didn't carry a name anyone would recognize. It simply read, "Read Mobility," because comfort is a right. Marcus noticed it one morning and said nothing. Emily noticed it too and smiled. On a late afternoon, when the heat finally loosened its grip, Emily walked beside Marcus toward the fading light. No cane, no braces, no audience, just two people moving at the same pace, comfortable with the silence between them. Some miracles never make headlines. They don't rewrite systems or erase injustice overnight. They don't arrive with certainty or spectacle. They show up quietly, in ordinary places, when someone chooses patience over fear and respect over control. And for those willing to see them, they are more than enough.